Hey friends, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Before we slip into the folds of forgotten time, tell me, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you watching from? Wherever you are, I hope you're warm, cozy, and ready to drift into a gentler place. So dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or let the hum of your heater do its work. Get snug under the covers. Now imagine. You wake up in total darkness. Not silence. No, the desert is never quiet, but something stiller than sound. You're in a stone chamber deep within the temple walls of Karnak. Cool limestone touches your back. The air is dry and holds the bitter scent of old incense and pressed linen. Outside, the moonlight brushes against sandstone statues, but inside, all is shadow. And this is where our night begins, with those who did not sleep while others did. 1. The oil lamp watchers of Karnak, the great temple complex of Karnak, during the New Kingdom era, was not simply a place of worship. It was a machine of cosmic order. And someone had to keep it running hour after hour, offering after offering, flame after flame. While most of ancient Egypt slept soundly in reed beds or under the stars, deep within the temple, the priesthood stirred. Their world turned not by sunrise and sunset, but by the rotation of ritual. As you lay in the dark chambers of this sacred complex, you wouldn't hear casual footsteps. Every sound was measured. A soft clink of copper bowls, the slow scrape of sandstone lids, a whisper of prayer uttered in tones so rhythmic they could almost lull the gods themselves to sleep. Midnight was not a resting point, it was a checkpoint. An entire subclass of priests, called the Wabu, the pure ones, were responsible for maintaining the sanctity of the divine presence housed in the inner sanctum. This wasn't symbolic. In the literal minds of these temple keepers, the gods were physically present in their shrines. And gods don't just vanish because it's dark out. So the night shift began. The lamps were checked first. Oil was a precious commodity, rationed carefully in tall ceramic jars sealed with linen. Each priest knew precisely how long a lamp could burn. They didn't just keep light for visibility. Light was the barrier against chaos. The concept of isfet, disorder, uncreation, was believed to slink in during the unguarded hours of darkness. The priest's job was to chase it out before it could root itself into the walls. As the oil hissed and flickered, shadows danced across murals that depicted Ray's nightly journey through the underworld. It was not lost on these men that they, too, were navigating a darkness filled with unseen forces. Their rituals weren't just performance. They were, in the mind of the state, what kept the universe functioning correctly. Outside the sanctum, other priests were performing night readings from temple scrolls, written in hieratic script, worn smooth from decades of recitation. The words had to be chanted aloud. Silent prayer didn't count. Not to the gods of Egypt. You had to make vibration. Sound was creative power. Even the dull, repetitive verses, line after line of praise, request, declaration, or sonic architecture, holding up the fabric of the cosmos. And the rules. Oh, the rules. A priest who entered sacred space at night had to be ritually clean. That meant shaved from head to toe, no sexual contact, no meat eaten for days, no contact with the unclean. Even dreams were scrutinized. If a priest had a nightmare before his night watch, he could be disqualified because it meant impurity had already breached his mind. It might seem suffocating now, but to these men, it was divine duty. There was no higher honor than being selected to serve the god during the hours when the world turned its back to him. And so the night would unfold in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Lamps tended, incense burned, scrolls read, statues clothed, then unclothed, water sprinkled, hymns offered. Every act, however small, repeated night after night, was believed to mirror the eternal acts of the gods themselves. You might wonder, did they ever drift off mid-prayer? Did the priests ever resent the grind of nocturnal devotion? Or perhaps was the stillness of night, the hush before the next chant, the only place they ever felt close to the gods? The deeper you go into the temple, the more the air changes. It's not just cooler, it's heavier. The thick limestone walls have, drunk in centuries of incense smoke, oil vapor, and the coppery tang of blood from past offerings. When you breathe, it's like exhaling through time itself. You walk slowly now, not out of reverence, though that lingers, but because it's so dark. You feel your steps might vanish altogether if you move too fast. The torchlight barely touches the edges of the hall. The flames from the sacred lamps are not meant to illuminate. They are meant to sustain. By the time you reach the innermost sanctuary, the naos, you're surrounded by silence, so dense it feels sculpted. This is where the god Amun's statue is kept. Not displayed, no. He's veiled, hidden from the world, only to be revealed by the most senior priests during dawn rituals or on grand feast days. But every night, before the sun returns, the god must be woken, washed, perfumed, dressed, and fed. Yes, fed. The priests brought trays with little loaves, beer in small ceramic jugs, roasted duck, fresh vegetables, all set carefully before the shrine. None of it was to be consumed, at least not until the god had taken in the essence of the meal. The leftovers would later be redistributed first to the priests, then sometimes to the temple workers. But before that, it was divine sustenance. The god had to be nourished, even while you slept. In the margins of the sanctuary, faint murmurs passed between the priests, but not in ordinary speech. They spoke the sacred words, a liturgical dialect so formal, so ancient, that even in their time it was already old-fashioned. Chanting wasn't just recitation, it was performance. Priests had to master cadence and pacing, trained in temple schools from youth. They had to know not only how to speak to the gods, but how not to bore them. One of the more curious nighttime duties was the inspection of dreams. Yes, dreams. The priests believed that the divine could speak through visions, particularly when the conscious mind was at rest. In special annexes near the temple courtyard, people came to sleep, commoners, nobles, even foreign travelers, hoping for healing, answers, or prophecy. These were known as incubation chambers. The walls were bare, the mats simple, but the space was heavily guarded against noise and impurity. A single flickering lamp lit each room. In the morning, dream scribes, priests trained in symbolic interpretation, would interview the sleeper, not to indulge them, but to extract potential divine messages. Was that crocodile you saw in your dream a warning? Or was it the god Sobit calling you to action? A bird flying backward? An ill omen? A golden cow? A blessing from Thor. This tradition of nighttime revelation meant that while some priests maintained the temple, others documented the invisible. They archived dreams, divinations, and omens, sometimes drawing crude illustrations to accompany the records. These records didn't collect dust, they influenced decisions. Political alliances, public festivals, even military campaigns were sometimes justified by a particularly vivid nighttime vision. So while the candles burned near Amun's shrine, men with reed pens and polished ostraka were scribbling furiously in other rooms, trying to make sense of divine whispers. And yet, despite the sacred gravity of it all, not every priest felt equally devoted. Some were deeply religious, yes. Others were careerist sons of priests, inheritors of a privileged life, going through the motions. For some, the ritual of night worship offered spiritual clarity. For others, it was boredom cloaked in perfume. But the structure, the immovable weight of tradition kept the temple running either way. You can imagine one such priest now, seated by the flickering light, his linen robes starched, his eyes tired, but his hands steady. He chants the lines he's known since childhood, barely registering the meaning. The god must be fed. The lamps must be refilled. The scrolls must be read. Outside, the stars wheel over the Nile. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal cries. The city of Thebes sleeps. But here, the priest remains, caught between fatigue and duty, between the mortal world and something much older, stranger, and less forgiving. And as he reaches for the oil jug to refill the flickering lamp before the gods' face, he pauses, not because the flame is dying, he expected that, but because, for a brief second, the shadows don't seem to behave. The flame dances, but the shadow behind the statue does not. And he wonders, was it the light playing tricks on him? Or had the god stirred? The final hours before dawn in the Karnak temple complex were the most delicate. It was the transition time, the passing of the world from night to light, from chaos back to order. In the minds of the priesthood, this was not a passive moment. It was a battleground. Every sunrise in ancient Egyptian belief was not guaranteed. The sun god Ra, after journeying through the underworld in his bark, had to defeat the serpent, Apophis, the great destroyer of light, before he could rise again. And the priests believed they had a role in this. Their rituals, chants, and nightly maintenance weren't just symbolic, they were metaphysical reinforcement. Without them, the sun might not return. Without them, existence might collapse. So now, in the thin hours before the first pale blush of morning, the priests moved more quickly. There was one last washing of the god's statue, one final incense offering. The bark of ray carved in gold and lapis was symbolically floated in a shallow basin of water, while the priesthood reenacted his victory in hushed tones. You are there again, watching, following their path. Priest carries a tray of natron, a sacred salt used for purification. Another sprinkles it into the basins, muttering spells older than his memory. A younger boy, an apprentice barely 15, holds a linen cloth to dry the sacred vessel. His hands tremble not from cold, but from the gravity of his role. And still, the lamps burn. Throughout the long night, these lamps have done more than cast light. They've kept Matt alive. Matt, the principle of balance and truth, the opposite of chaos. In the darkest hours, Matt was at its most fragile. The priests were its stewards, guarding it through ritual repetition. Pour the oil, trim the wick, replace the offering, chant the lines, repeat, repeat, repeat. Sometimes this monotony broke. There are records, odd fragments left on ostraka and temple walls that speak of interruptions. Strange sounds in the sanctuary, cold gusts of air from sealed corridors, dreams too vivid to explain. One such record, faint and fragmented, describes a movement in the veil. Scholars debate the meaning. Some think it refers to a literal curtain in the shrine. Others believe it was a vision, an experience only those who served at night could understand. There were also nights when the gods refused to wake. The priests would perform the rituals as usual, washing clothing, feeding. But the signs that the god had accepted the offering, signs only they knew how to read, didn't appear. The flame would sputter. The water would stay still. A statue's gaze would feel cold. When that happened, the night did not end as usual. Extra prayers were added. The offering trays were replaced. Priests bathed again. Sometimes sacrifices were made in haste just before sunrise, in case the god's displeasure threatened the renewal of the day. The fear was real. You might wonder how much of this was belief and how much was performance. But to them, it wasn't a matter of either or. The line between divine and mundane was thin. The rituals created reality. And by the time the first rays of sunlight touched the pylons of the temple, the priests tired, oil-stained, smelling of incense and natron. had ensured that time itself could continue. Only then were the shrines sealed again. The god, freshly bathed and fed, would rest until the next cycle. The scrolls were rolled, the lamps were extinguished, the guards rotated, and the night priests finally emerged into the light eyes squinting, bones stiff, mouths dry from chanting. Some of them would go home. Others would stay, performing administrative tasks or reading omens from bird fights and Nile tides. A few collapsed in shadowed courtyards, napping beneath palm trees until summoned again. But all of them shared one truth: the gods never really slept. Even in the dead of night, someone had to remain awake, and in that eternal pattern of offering, and watching, of praying, and pouring oil. The priests of Karnak found something the outside world never saw: a silence that was not empty, but expectant, as if the stone walls listened, as if the gods were not gone, just waiting to be noticed again. -2. The ones who heard the stars are no longer inside the stone belly of Karnak. Now you're standing barefoot on the smooth upper terrace of a temple roof, high above the city of Thebes. It's long past midnight. The heat of the day has finally released its grip, and a breeze flows over the Nile like a sigh. The stars, so many stars, blanket the sky with more clarity than you've ever seen. There are no city lights to drown them. The constellations aren't silent here. They speak, and someone is listening, in the still hours of the night. Long before astronomy was a science, priests known as the Hour Watchers, or stargazers, climbed to the tops of temples, with only their memories and the heavens to guide them. Their job wasn't to admire the stars, it was to record their speech, to decipher the divine. They didn't use telescopes. No charts printed on parchment. No instruments more complex than a plumb line, a palm frond, and their minds. But they knew the sky like a scribe knows ink. They memorized the rising times of stars, the slow drift of constellations over the seasons, and which gods whispered through which points of light. This was sacred astronomy. To chart the stars was to read the pulse of the gods. The priests believed that the stars were not merely distant fires, but living signs. Divine scribbles scrawled across the night for those trained enough to read them. Each decan a 10-day division of the ancient Egyptian calendar had its own star or group of stars that would rise just before dawn, marking not only time but destiny. The appearance of a certain star might predict a flood. Another might foretell war or a favorable harvest. Still others were linked with dreams, with sickness, with kings. The Hour Watchers kept track of time using the positions of these decanal stars. In a world without clocks, this was how midnight was known from the third hour before dawn. On temple ceilings like those found in Dendera or Edfu, you can still see the results of their efforts. Intricate star charts, full of deities rowing, boats across constellations, planets shown as gods with falcon heads or glowing discs. You imagine one such priest now. He's old, his robe is patched, but his memory is flawless. Each night, he lies flat on the rooftop stone, one hand under his head, the other pointing to a specific star. He waits, counts, then nods. Behind him, a younger apprentice scribbles something on a wooden tablet with a thin stylus. The boy doesn't know what it means yet, but the old priest does. It means the heliacal rising of Sapit, what we now call Sirius, is close. That star, so bright it seems like a celestial ember, signals the coming of the annual Nile flood, and with it, life. For millennia, this moment was one of Egypt's most sacred. It was celebrated with feasts, offerings, and sometimes national holidays. But for these night watchers, it started with silence, with staring into the velvet dark until Sapit pierced the edge of the eastern horizon like a silver dagger. Sometimes the watchers weren't just predicting floods, they were choosing rulers. When a pharaoh died, The priests of the temple sometimes consulted the stars to determine auspicious dates for burial or the divine legitimacy of the successor. Was the new ruler born under a star linked with Horus? Or worse, Set? Was the alignment of Mars and Venus favorable for peace, or did it promise unrest? Not all temple priests were invited to interpret the stars. It was a specialized role, and those chosen were initiates in a knowledge tradition far older than they understood. They studied not just astronomy, but cosmology, learning the mythical geography of the heavens, the story of Nut, the sky goddess who swallowed the sun each night and birthed it each morning. They knew which planets were wanderers, which stars were fixed, and how to read omens from sudden changes, a shooting star, a blood moon, a veiled eclipse dot, and unlike daytime rituals full of incense, processions, and the loud clamor of temple music, these sky-watching nights were quiet, reverent. The only sound was the occasional creak of stone, or the rustle of papyrus as another chart was copied by hand. Sometimes the priests would fast before a significant celestial event. Others slept during the day and lived only in the nocturnal hours, adjusting their whole bodies to match the cycles of the sky. There are stories, half-whispered, in later dynastic texts that speak of priests who could hear the stars. Not literally, of course, but they believed that stars gave off spiritual tones, divine vibrations. If one tuned oneself through meditation and purification, they could feel the harmony or the dissonance of the cosmos, even now, lying quietly. Beneath the ancient sky of Thebes, you can understand the awe. The desert wind brushes your face. The stars blink. And somewhere above you, the gods seem to hum. But as the priest draws a slow breath and marks one more rising star, a troubling question begins to creep into his mind, one shared by generations before and after him. What happens when the stars go silent? The wind has shifted now. It carries the bite of dust from the desert and the chill of something unspoken. The elder priest sits upright on the stone rooftop, adjusting the frayed edge of his linen shawl. The sky above him is still lit with stars, but something feels off, not visibly. The stars are where they've always been. Orion still leans on his side. Sopdet still flickers near the horizon. But in the priest's bones trained by decades of unbroken celestial rhythm, there is dissonance. An itch in the soul. Something in the sky is wrong, and he isn't alone. Across Egypt, during certain reigns and dynasties, there were entire years when the stars refused to follow their ancient choreography. How comets streaked unexpectedly. Eclipses startled entire cities. Once reliable patterns stuttered or appeared to vanish. And to the priest astronomers, these weren't just scientific puzzles. They were divine disturbances. To understand their fear, you must understand their world. To an Egyptian temple priest, the universe was order. Mat. Everything had its place on earth and in the sky. The gods themselves were assigned to specific celestial bodies. If the stars misbehaved, it wasn't just weather. It was rebellion. Historical texts hint at these uneasy periods. In the reign of Akhenaten, for instance, the so-called heretic pharaoh, who upended the traditional gods and worshipped the Aten, the sun disk star observations became fragmented. Ritual. Calendars were discarded, and ancient constellations fell out of use. Some records suggest priests protested quietly. Others kept secret logs, privately recording astronomical events that no longer matched what they were taught. On rooftops like this one, faithful priests watched helplessly as the order unraveled. One surviving tablet from the Temple of Abydos in the western desert records a priest's lament during one such starless season. In it, he writes of the star of the river refusing to rise, and Ra's light being consumed by a serpent with no name. The imagery is cosmic, yes, but it's also practical. These disruptions meant no calendar, no sacred timings, no predictions. The temple's authority, based on its ability to interpret the will of the heavens, was shaken. Some priests believed these silences were punishments. Others thought they were tests. But a few, in quiet rebellion, began to adapt. They abandoned the older decanal system and turned toward planetary observation. Venus, Jupiter, Mercury. These wanderers, as they were called, moved differently. Less predictably, but perhaps more personally. Maybe the gods were no longer speaking through the old stars. Maybe they had chosen new voices. The elder priest now rises to his feet. The stone under him is cold. The sky glows faintly blue and the distance dawn is creeping in. But the star he waited for has not come. It should have risen an hour ago. Every record, every year, says so. And yet nothing. He doesn't shout. He doesn't panic. Instead, he bows his head and kneels on the rooftop. Not in failure, but in recalibration. Because he knows something all stargazing priests eventually came to accept. The gods were never static. They didn't live in fixed positions, predictable as sundials. They moved, they changed, and sometimes they disappeared, not to punish, but to remind the watchers below that the stars were not maps. But messages and messages change. So he begins a new chant, one not recorded in scrolls, a whisper of his own invention. He sings not to the absent star, but to the silence itself, hoping it too is listening. Below, in the temple courtyard, a novice looks up and sees the old priest, alone and bowed, haloed by the first gold of sunrise. He doesn't know why the star didn't rise, but something in the old man's stillness tells him that it matters less than learning how to wait in the dark without fear. And so the novice, too, begins to listen, not just to the sky, but to the spaces in between, because perhaps, just perhaps, the silence was the message all along. By the time the priest steps down from the rooftop, the temple is already stirring. Bronze bowls clatter faintly in the distance. Water is being drawn from clay jars. Somewhere, a gate creaks open to admit the first sun. But the priest walks slowly, his bare feet tracing the grooves worn into the stone by generations before him. The night silence still clings to him. He passes other priests without speaking. Some nod. Others glance briefly upward, toward the brightening sky, unsure of what they'll find today or not find. The stars are gone now, hidden in daylight. But their absence is only physical. For those who watch them all night, they remain behind the eyes. Inside a quiet chamber of the temple half-library, half-sanctuary, the priest unrolls a scroll made of papyrus that smells faintly of old ink and dust. It's one of many. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of narrow scrolls and tablets line the stone shelves. Some are so old their ink is bled into the fibers, barely legible. But they are priceless. These are the star diaries. Not holy texts, not mythic dailies, but raw nightly accounts of the stars. What rose, what didn't, what flickered, what returned. Some entries are detailed, others cryptic. A single line, no signal from Sopdet, or Venus burned longer than expected. Some scrolls include small sketches, ink-drawn stars, connected by trembling hands. Some include dates. Others don single quotes T. The priest adds today's entry in silence. He writes, expected the river star a third hour before dawn. No appearance. Wind from north. Silence. Offerings made. No sign. Then, as he often does, he adds a line not for the temple records, but for himself. A kind of quiet poetry, never meant for reading. He writes, if the gods no longer write in fire, perhaps they now speak in pauses. These star diaries were never considered important by the scribes of kings. They weren't copied into monumental inscriptions or read. At festivals, they didn't promise victory in battle or celebrate the divine birth of a pharaoh, but they endured. Why? Because they were honest. The priests who kept them weren't just recording data. They were preserving faith. Not blind faith in gods, but faith in observation, in patience, in the rhythm of night. They knew the stars would sometimes vanish, that the sky would go quiet, but they kept watching. They kept writing. Centuries later, when scholars from Greece arrived in Egypt, men like Ptolemy, who would go on to revolutionize astronomy, they studied these very diaries. They used the old Egyptian records to track planetary motion and retrograde behavior. And though the priests who wrote them never knew it, their quiet, boring little scrolls shaped the future of celestial science. Even now, tucked away in museum, archives or buried beneath sand, fragments of these star journals continue to surface. Papyrus browned by time, glyphs barely etched, but always waiting to be read again. It's strange, isn't it? The very men who feared their stars were going silent turned out to be the loudest voices in the long conversation between heaven and earth. And so you return to the rooftop one last time, where the priest once stood, face tilted upward, mouth barely moving. There are no stars now, just sky. But you hear something, don't you? Not words, not music. Just attention. As if something beyond the blue was listening back. As if the stars were waiting for your question. 3. The sacred sleepers. It's quiet again, but not the peaceful kind. This is the silence of stone beneath earth, of thick air in a sealed room, of incense long since burned out. You're underground now, in the burial chamber of a temple priest, not dead, but sleeping. Because yes, in certain sacred orders of ancient Egypt, there were priests who chose to sleep inside coffins every single night. Not as a stunt, not for punishment, but as part of their ritual, as preparation, as alignment with the divine cycle of death and rebirth. The room you're in is small, barely large, enough to stand in and built deep into the temple's substructure. The walls are plastered smooth, painted with faint hieroglyphs worn by time. The air smells of earth and faint cedar resin. And in the center of this space lies the object of focus, a rectangular wooden coffin, undecorated, its lid propped open slightly. Inside, a man sleeps. His head rests on a wooden headrest, not a cushion. His hands are crossed over his chest. He is breathing softly. To the untrained eye, he might look already embalmed, but he is alive, barely stirring, almost indistinguishable from the dead he imitates. This is not ordinary behavior, even in ancient Egypt, but for priests in certain mystery cults, especially those dedicated to Osiris, god of the dead ritual. Death was a tool of transformation. To serve Osiris, you had to imitate him. And Osiris, after all, was murdered, dismembered, and resurrected. So these priests practiced nightly dying. The reasoning behind it wasn't macabre, it was theological. To become closer to Osiris, one had to experience symbolic death. Sleep, they believed, was the nearest state to death without passing through the veil. And the coffin was not a tomb, but a gateway, a place to train the soul for the transition that would one day be permanent. Each night, before entering the coffin, the priest would perform a brief purification ritual. He would bathe in cool water, anoint his skin with oils, and recite verses from the Book of the Dead, not as a final rite, but as rehearsal. Then, dressed in a simple white robe, he would climb into the coffin, lay down, and whisper a prayer to Osiris. I descend, willingly, so that I may rise with power. The practice served other functions, too. By sleeping in such a confined, ritualized space, the priest cut himself off from distractions, from dreams even. It was said that to sleep in the coffin long enough would eventually bring a kind of stillness, what they called ket hedep, or corpse tranquility, a peaceful non-existence that trained the body to accept whatever was next. But not all could handle it. Some initiates abandoned the practice after only a few nights, plagued by nightmares or waking hallucinations. Some said they felt watched by the spirits of the real dead. Others described the terrifying moment of awakening when breath returned and the body moved again, but the mind remained elsewhere, between worlds. Still, those who continued were respected deeply, even feared. The sacred sleepers were said to carry a different presence, an energy that made others uncomfortable. They spoke softly, walked slowly, and kept their gaze low. But their words carried weight. If one of them warned of danger, people listened. Their lives were lonely. Most never married. They spent days in service cleansing, chanting, preparing the funerary rites of others. But their nights were spent with the dead. One wonders how much they feared death, or if they ever did. And as you linger quietly in this sealed room, watching the sleeping priest, a strange thought arises. What kind of person chooses to practice dying every night? And more curiously, what do they hope to see on the other side of sleep? By morning, the priest rises from his coffin like mist from the Nile, slow, silent, with no fanfare. He doesn't stretch or yawn. He simply opens his eyes, unfolds his hands, and sits up as if returning from a journey he can't quite describe. There is no audience, no blessing, no congratulations for surviving the night. This is routine, but what he doesn't tell anyone, what none of the sacred sleepers ever do, is what they dream, because that is part of the discipline. The dreams must remain unspoken. You see, unlike the dream incubation rituals practiced by temple healers, where visions were recorded and interpreted by priests for divine messages or cures, the coffin dreams were never shared, not even with fellow initiates. To do so would have broken the vow of silence that bound the sacred sleeper. It was believed that speaking a coffin dream aloud would drain its power, or worse, invite death before its time. These weren't ordinary dreams. They weren't symbolic, poetic wanderings. They were vivid, structured. Some described a landscape, more consistent than waking life, full of temples, rivers, passageways that reappeared night after night. Many sleepers believed they were visiting the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, not metaphorically, but literally. Night after night, they traveled a map only they could see. The Book of the Dead was no bedtime story to them. It was a guidebook. The Hall of Judgment, the weighing of the heart, the fields of reeds. These were not myths to ponder, but places to prepare for. The coffin became a dry run for death, and the dreams, a rehearsal for eternity. There are faint records etched into stone or hidden in obscure papyri of what happened when sleepers couldn't keep their silence. One priest, in the early Third Intermediate Period, reportedly woke screaming from his coffin, fled the temple, and began wandering the streets of Memphis telling strangers what he saw. His own funeral, the mourners' faces, the exact words spoken. At his tomb, he died 3 days later. Another account, this one in a fragmented temple diary, mentions a priest who recorded a coffin dream anyway. His words were shaky, barely readable. He claimed to have seen a gatekeeper with the head of a lion and the body of a child. When he asked its name, the figure said, "You already know it." After that, the priest refused to speak again, not out of madness, but as a choice. He lived in silence until his burial, in the same coffin he'd slept in for 22 years. Of course, these tales drift between fact and legend. No one knows exactly what was seen in those nightly crossings. And perhaps that's the point. To sleep in a coffin was not simply symbolic, it was transformational. The priest who began the practice was not the same man who emerged a year later. The silence changed him. The solitude etched lines into his mind that ordinary speech could never trace. But why? Why take on such a burden? Why commit to such isolation? The answer, whispered through temple halls and preserved in faded ink, was simple: to master fear. Fear of death was seen as a spiritual weakness. The sacred sleeper sought not to escape death, but to become intimate with it, to lie beside it, nightly, until it no longer had power, until it was known not. And so, every evening, after the last chants had faded and the lamps were dimmed, the sleeper would return to his coffin, step inside, and lower the lid alone with his breath, his heartbeat, and the silent company of the afterlife. No guards, no acolytes, no sound. Just the slow rhythm of preparation, of letting go. And still, the strangest question remains: if death had a face, did the sleepers come to recognize it? Or worse, did it begin to recognize them? There comes a time when the nightly rehearsal ends, not because the priest is too old, or because the temple rules change, but because the day finally arrives when he does not rise from the coffin. The difference, however, is quiet. No wailing, no panic. The temple has prepared for this moment since the first time. He laid down and closed the lid. The other priests approach the chamber softly. They already know, not because they checked his breath, there's no need, but because the air has changed. The silence has deepened. Something has passed through and taken nothing with it. In the tradition of the sacred sleepers, the day of death is not feared, it is fulfilled. The coffin, which served as a nightly bed, now serves as his final vessel. But unlike others, there is no ceremonial transfer, no new box, no procession to a distant necropolis. He is buried exactly where he slept, the lid worn smooth from years. Of lifting and lowering is gently closed. The incense is lit, not the strong kind, but the dry blue myrrh used for inner sanctums. A scroll is placed near his head, not to guide his soul, but to honor what he already knew. The inscription reads, simply, asterisk. He knew the door. He rehearsed the crossing. He did not forget the words. Asterisk. But this priest is not unique. Archaeologists in later centuries would discover burial chambers beneath remote temple complexes that broke the standard mold. Small, unmarked tombs. No elaborate frescoes, no golden masks. Just plain coffins, sometimes stacked beside one another, with worn stone grooves in the floor indicating movement, use, repetition. These were not tombs for the high elite. They were working graves, places of practice. In one particularly unusual find, beneath the temple of Abydos, an undecorated coffin was discovered with faint finger grooves along the rim, worn smooth. Inside was a single funerary amulet in the shape of a lotus, a symbol not just of rebirth, but of awakening. No name was recorded. No cartouche, just the faint carving on the wall nearby. Asterisk, I lay down knowing I would rise. Asterisk, perhaps the most striking part of the sacred sleeper's legacy is not their devotion to death, but their radical peace with it. They did not build monuments to defy time. They did not seek to immortalize themselves through grandeur or gold. They simply practiced, quietly, night after night, until the practice became real. And still, their presence lingers. Some temple walls, in places now buried under sand, carry no record of great kings or battles, but faint impressions in stone where coffins were once slid, shifted, lifted. These grooves are their legacy, not words, not art. But movement, worn paths. And if you listen closely in those chambers, in the cracks of the limestone and the still air, you might still feel it. That quiet exhale, that discipline, that patience. And you might ask, what happens when a man trains himself so well for death that he no longer needs to die to be transformed? 4. The midnight bleeders. You're standing now at the edge of the desert, where the temple meets the dunes. The moon above is unnaturally bright, round, full, and silver, against a black velvet sky. The wind is quiet, as if holding its breath. And down below, in a stone courtyard carved with faded lunar glyphs, a small group of priests stand in a tight half-circle. Their robes flutter like ghosts. Each holds a thin blade dot, no grand altar, no crowds. This is not a public ceremony. It happens quietly, every lunar cycle, when the moon reaches fullness and begins to tip back into shadow. The priests gather, not to pray, but to bleed. You wouldn't find this practice mentioned in the great temple reliefs. This was no royal rite. It belonged to a marginal group of moon priests' men who worshipped Khonsu, the lunar god, in his darker, transitional form. Not the playful child of myth, but the stern, watchful god of time, madness, and regeneration. To serve Khonsu was to understand flux. Light into dark, fullness into absence, control into chaos. And the priests who bore this burden didn't chant hymns. They made offerings of flesh their own. Each full moon, just as the bright edge began to wane, these priests performed the ritual of thinning, a practice passed down through oral tradition, never formally codified. Each man would take a ritual blade, usually bronze or obsidian, purified in salt and moonlight, and make a shallow cut on the inside of his forearm. Never deep, never to harm. Just enough to draw blood, and in doing so, symbolically release the excess within. They believed the full moon could cause internal swelling of emotion, desire, anxiety forces that had to be balanced by voluntary. Letting go, they would bleed onto smooth white stones arranged in a crescent. No word spoken. Just the sound of the night wind, the soft hiss of desert sand, and the occasional drop of blood tapping stone. These were not frenzied rituals. There was no screaming, no ecstasy. It was slow, controlled. The pain was part of the prayer. Afterward, the priests would sit in silence, sometimes for hours, watching the moon shrink as if drinking back its own fullness. Only when the moon dipped below the horizon did they leave arms. Bandaged in linen, robes stained, eyes unreadable. Most Egyptians worshipped Re, the sun god. His light was warm, structured, knowable. But the lunar priests saw something else in the night sky, something changeable, unstable. They believed the moon held secrets too delicate for daylight, and those secrets, if not managed, could undo. A man from the inside, the priesthood was small, isolated, recruited not from noble families, but often from those considered sensitive men who heard voices, saw visions, or reacted strangely to moonlight. Instead of shunning them, the temples sometimes brought them into Khonsu's service, believing their afflictions were signs of lunar touch. To be a lunar priest was to live on the edge of acceptability. They were respected, yes, but uneasily. Other priests avoided their gaze. Some feared they could cause illness with a glance. Others whispered they had power over dreams. The bleeding ritual was said to keep their minds intact, to prevent the overflow of lunar energy. Without it, they believed madness would set in. And sometimes it did. There are half-buried temple scrolls, rare, brittle things that speak of a priest who refused to bleed during a particularly strong moon. He claimed he no longer needed the ritual. Days later, he wandered into the Nile and was found hours later speaking in broken tongues, convinced he had been swallowed by a goddess of shadows. He never served again. But what did the bleeding truly mean? Was it an offering? A purge? A symbolic surrender? Or was it something even stranger, an act of control over the uncontrollable? As you linger beside the crescent of stones, the last drops of blood drying in the sand, you wonder, what happens when a priest makes his body the altar? And what price does the moon demand in return? The moon is waning now, its perfect curve broken, its light a little less whole. But the temple priests of Khonsu are not resting. This is when they watch most closely. Not the moon itself, but each other. because the days after the bleeding ritual are the most dangerous. Some priests describe it as a kind of aftermath, a sensation of having opened something that doesn't close easily. The cuts on their arms heal too quickly, as if the body barely noticed, but inside, something stirs. A rawness, a surge, and sometimes a fracture. The lunar priests called it Chetkeperu, multiplying selves, a state in which the boundaries of the mind dissolve, and a man begins to dream while awake, to forget his own name, to speak in voices not his own. And yet, this state was not considered an illness. It was initiation. Not all reached it. Many served their entire lives without falling into that internal eclipse. But those who did were either removed from temple service quietly or elevated. You see, in the Kansu cult, madness was not weakness. It was a risk of proximity. The closer one came to the moon's essence, the more likely they were to dissolve into it. Those who survived such dissolution were believed to have seen beyond. Some were sent to isolation, not as punishment, but preservation. They were called the mirror bearers, priests who no longer bled with blades, but carried polished silver discs strapped to their arms. They stared into the reflections at night, murmuring words that no scroll recorded. Their role? No one knows for sure. Some believed they were watching for signs of lunar invasion when the moon's essence slipped into dreams across Egypt, whispering too loudly. Others believed the mirror bearers spoke back to the moon, not as servants, but as equals. In one deeply buried storeroom at the temple of Khonsu in Karnak, archaeologists uncovered a bundle of broken mirrors wrapped in faded linen. Most had been shattered deliberately, but one remained intact. On its back, etched in a tight spiral, was a single inscription. Asterisk, what you see is only safe when you bleed it away. Asterisk, even today, the full meaning of this is debated. Was it metaphorical? Psychological? A warning? There were, of course, skeptics. Later scribes in more solar-focused cults dismissed the bleeders as deluded mystics, accusing them of self-harm and irrational rites. One record from the reign of Seti II refers to moon madmen who soil their own skin and confuse silence for wisdom. But even the skeptics admitted something strange. Those who served the moon lived longer than expected. Many reached old age with clear minds, unshaken hands, and an unsettling calm. Some even claimed they predicted their own deaths down to the hour, laying down one evening and simply not waking up. In one instance, a lunar priest reportedly bled during a new moon, not customary, and calmly told his apprentice, Khonsu has taken his breath back. I am finished. He passed the next morning. The apprentice took his place in the circle that month. No fanfare, just the blade, the stone, the moon. But beneath all of this, beneath the cuts, the mirrors, the silence, there's a deeper truth. These priests weren't just managing madness. They were protecting the rest of us from it, because the moon touches everyone. It pulls the tide. It stirs the blood. It alters dreams. But only the bleeders accepted that madness was a tide that couldn't be stopped, only thinned, drawn out, bled gently under moonlight before it rose too high and drowned the soul. And so, when you next feel the moon pressing against your thoughts, ask yourself, what part of you is overfull? And what, if anything, might need to be let go? The moon no longer shines the way it once did. That's what the last of the lunar priests believed. In the final years of the Khonsu cult's influence, when the old temples were fading and solar cults ruled almost exclusively, the bleeding rituals continued, but the meaning began to thin. Like the crescent moon itself, the priests still gathered, still cut, still whispered their silent prayers to the moon. But something had shifted. The air was different. The night less charged, and the moon less attentive. One priest, A man named Menre left behind a small collection of writings found centuries later on folded parchment tucked inside a broken water vessel. His script was cramped and slanted, written with ink made from burned lotus. Petals, it reads, asterisk, she used to listen. I could feel it. A pulse behind the sky. Now I feel only stone. Asterisk, it was not bitterness, but sorrow. As if the relationship had ended not abruptly, but by erosion. Other priests echoed this quiet despair. Some believed the moon had grown weary of them. Others feared they had bled too much drawn too close, and now she had withdrawn, unreachable. A few blamed the changes in the calendar, the rewriting of rituals by royal decree, the shifting priorities of temple hierarchy. But deep down they knew the gods were changing. Khonsu remained in the myths, yes, but the visceral, intimate rituals of the moon bleeders began to vanish from record. No one wished to inherit them. Apprentices were reassigned. The old bloodstones were buried or tossed into the river. The ritual blades rusted beneath sand. Still, a few held on. In small, remote shrines along the Nile, under crumbling arches and half-buried obelisks, the last bleeders performed their rites, sometimes alone, with no other priests left to witness. They cut, bled, and waited for a sound, a signal, a dream, anything, but the silence persisted. And yet, they did not stop, Dot, because to stop would be to admit that the tides of the mind could no longer be balanced, that the moon's pull had become arbitrary. That order, Maut, no longer governed the sky, and they couldn't accept that. Not after lifetimes of listening. One final tale, recorded anonymously in the temple ruins at El Kab, describes a solitary priest found in the desert, arms scarred, eyes clouded. He claimed to be the last ear of the moon. When asked what the moon had said to him, he simply replied, asterisk, nothing. But she looked at me, and I remembered I was still real. Asterisk, he died that night under a sliver of moonlight, wrapped in his blood-stained robe. He was buried where he fell. No inscription, no offering, just sand. But even now, in the ruins of Khonsu's forgotten altars, there are crescent-shaped arrangements of white stones, some cracked, some missing but still aligned, still waiting. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, and the moon hangs low over the horizon, travelers report hearing a single drop-hit stone, not no water. No footstep, not just a memory, a reminder that someone once bled not to die, but to stay whole. 5. The sand-eater's sun is merciless today. High, bright, and white-hot as it hangs over the temple at Abydos. There's no shade in the desert courtyard, and the ground beneath your feet is dust-dry, so parched it squeaks beneath your sandals. And yet, sitting motionless on a flat stone slab, head bowed and lips cracked, is a priest who hasn't eaten in 24 days. Not because of scarcity, but because he is waiting for a vision. You've found yourself among the sand-eaters, strange and almost entirely forgotten sect of Egyptian priesthood, whose most sacred act was not to chant, or to bleed, or even to bury, but to fast, Dot, and not just food. They gave up salt, fruit, shade, company, and eventually water, their name. Sand-eaters came not from actual consumption of sand, though some reportedly did chew it during the worst hunger, but from their willingness to empty the body until they were as bare as the dunes themselves. Their purpose? To clear the vessel so thoroughly that the gods might finally fill it. Unlike the more structured temple cults with calendars and hierarchies, the sand-eaters followed no official doctrine. They were fringe mystics, often solitary, though loosely, connected through oral transmission. Most worship Thoth, god of hidden knowledge, or Set, the god of desert chaos and unknowable power. A few served Isis, but not as mother or healer, rather as the keeper of forbidden wisdom. Their practice was simple, and brutal. Once chosen, usually between the ages of 20 and 30, the initiate would leave the temple walls and travel deep into the desert, carrying only a waterskin, a white linen wrap, and a smooth black stone. He would dig a shallow circle in the sand, lay the stone at the center, and sit. From that point on, he would eat nothing. Not for a day, not for a week, but for as long as it took. The goal was to reach a state they called sa-se, or white fire, a condition where the mind detached from the body, where visions arrived unbidden, and where the initiate no longer needed food, or speech, or even thought. Some reached it in 2 weeks. Others took over a month. Many never returned, but those who did return came back different. They were gaunt, yes, skin stretched, eyes sunken, teeth sometimes lost. But behind their broken forms was a quiet certainty. They claimed to have seen something, not with their eyes, not in dreams, but in the fire that begins when the body is close to ending. They described vast corridors beneath the desert, not physical, but real, filled with shifting hieroglyphs, animal-headed guides, and invisible hands pulling at their thoughts. Some said they watched time fold in half. Others heard names they weren't allowed to repeat. A few came back unable to speak at all, simply scratching symbols in the dirt with trembling fingers. And some came back laughing, not mad, exactly, but unbothered by hunger, politics, fear, as if they'd been shown something too large to ever explain, and had chosen instead to smile quietly until death. These priests rarely rejoined temple life. They lived on the margins, writing, teaching, or wandering the riverbanks. They refused offerings of food. Some never touched cooked meals again, living instead on dried reeds, wild roots, and the occasional handful of sand licked from their own fingers. They were both revered and avoided. Children whispered that they could curse a man with silence. Farmers left them water without speaking. Other priests consulted them only when dreams grew too strange, or omens too difficult to decipher. Still, the rituals continued. Not in public, not by order, but because somewhere in Egypt, always, someone believed that the gods could only speak when all else was emptied. And as you watch this priest now motionless, skin flaking under the sun, you wonder, what kind of vision is worth starving for? And if he opens his eyes tonight, what will he see? The second week is when the shaking begins, not the obvious tremors of weakness that comes earlier and passes. No, this is something stranger. A stillness inside the shaking, a kind of internal hum, like the mind has begun to vibrate apart from the body. The priest in the sandpit no longer responds to the sun. His skin has burned, flaked, healed, and burned again. He does not speak. He no longer blinks. His waterskin ran dry 3 days ago. He hasn't cried, hasn't moved, hasn't acknowledged the scorpions that passed over his feet. He is waiting. This is the threshold the sand-eaters called white fire, a point where the soul begins to loosen, hover, and finally wander. You cannot see it from outside. He appears broken, starved, nearly gone. But inside, if their testimonies can be believed, something is igniting, not in a painful way, not like fever or hunger pangs, but like a slow, radiant awareness that begins behind the eyes and spreads outward. The white fire state is described in only a few known sources. One is a clay tablet fragment found near Dakhla Oasis, preserved inside a sealed jar alongside fragments of reed sandals and cracked teeth. The script is simple. Asterisk. When the fire arrives, you do not burn. You expand. You hear the wind inside stones. You feel gods crawling under your skin. You are not yourself, but you are not another either. Asterisk. Those who returned from this state rarely described what they saw directly. It was considered dangerous. To give the vision a name was to reduce it. Some claimed it was a place with no edges, filled with echoes. Others hinted at an infinite library beneath the dunes where every word ever spoken waited in scrolls made of breath. Some described the voices of the dead not as ghosts, but as living thoughts drifting past like wind through reed's dot. And then there were those who met the desert goddess Dot. She was not part of official mythology, not listed in temple records. But among the sand-eaters, she was known, a faceless being of wind and bone, neither merciful nor cruel. She came when the body broke open. Some described her touch as cold silk. Others said she tasted like copper. She never spoke, but left images behind. Patterns, visions, knowledge. One initiate, after a 19-day fast, returned and immediately carved 3 perfect geometric spirals into a rock face. They were mathematically precise, beyond his known ability. He collapsed afterward and died the next day. Another priest, after surviving white fire, touched a dying child and whispered a single phrase. The child recovered fully by dawn. The priest never spoke again. Of course, many failed. Some never reached the state. They passed into delirium, then death, without vision. Others broke the fast, unable to endure. They returned to the temple, in shame, often choosing exile. But those who succeeded were marked forever. Even after their bodies recovered, if they did, there was something different in their gaze, slower, deeper, as if they were still watching the visions, even with open eyes. They never feared hunger again. Most rejected names, wore no color, and slept in sand rather than under roofs. Some claimed they no longer needed dreams because they had already seen the final one. The last known sand-eater, recorded during the early Roman period in Egypt, lived in a crumbling shrine outside Siwa Oasis. A Greek traveler wrote of him, saying, he did not eat, but he drank moonlight. He touched no one, but people left him silver coins anyway. When I asked his name, he said, I used to be thirsty. And then he turned to the desert and began to walk. No records after that. Just the empty circle in the sand where he had. Sat. And so the ritual faded, not by destruction, but by disappearance. No scrolls, no formal ending. Just a long silence, like the end of a windstorm. Yet somewhere, across the dunes, there may still be someone sitting on a black stone, waiting for the fire. Because perhaps the real hunger isn't for food, or water, or comfort, but to know what waits when the body gives up everything. And something else steps in. The priest is no longer in the sand circle. The sun has risen, and fallen more times than anyone counted, and the winds have begun to erase the outline of his sitting place. A smooth black stone still rests there, half buried. The linen he wore has blown across the courtyard like a discarded thought, but the priest is gone, not dead, at least not in the way others would expect, because those who fasted to the edge, who reached Sase, the white fire, did not always return in ways that made sense. Some were found miles away, barefoot, standing in waist-deep water, as if waiting for something else to emerge. Others were discovered asleep in tombs, curled up beside the bones of strangers, humming quietly. One was found beneath the altar of a temple to Hathor, having crawled there in silence, carving a single symbol again and again, a circle within a circle within a circle. The temple scribes, of course, dismissed these wanderers as sun-struck, malnourished mystics. But those who listened carefully, those who looked into their eyes, noticed something that couldn't be explained. The absence of want. No hunger, no ambition, no fear. It was as if the fast had eaten more than the body. One initiate, when pressed to explain what he had seen, simply said, there is a silence behind the world. I sat in it. It was not empty. This was the great paradox of the sand-eaters. They gave up everything: food, water, speech, comfort, and found something. Not power, not prophecy, but clarity. A state of being so refined, so stripped, of distraction, that even the gods, it seemed, leaned down to listen out in time. The practice faded. Not through condemnation, but evaporation. Fewer and fewer dared to sit in the sand. The temples began to close. Rome moved in. Scrolls were copied. For politics, not mysticism. Hunger became a medical problem, not a sacred path. And yet, in the deeper parts of the desert, where the dunes move like slow waves, travelers have found things. Circles in the sand, stones arranged in star patterns, pieces of linen wrapped around smooth, dry bones. And just once a scroll, sealed in a jar, bearing only this phrase, asterisk, the gods do not shout. They wait for us to become quiet enough to hear. Asterisk, no name signed. No temple seal. Just that dot, and perhaps that is the final lesson of the sand eaters. That the deepest wisdom is not shouted, not chanted, not even spoken. It is earned through emptiness, that it waits in the hollow places, that it rises when the body fades. And maybe, even now, beneath the noise of modern life and the rhythms of your own breath, there is something waiting to speak. But only if you're hungry enough to listen. 6. The bone scribes. The temple is gone now, just rubble and sand. The columns lie like toppled gods, and the jackals keep watch from the ridgeline. But somewhere beneath your feet, buried under centuries of dust, is a burial vault. Unlike any other dot, it contains no scrolls, no statues, no gold, only bones, but not ordinary bones. These are rib cages carved with glyphs, femurs covered in lines of tiny script, vertebrae notched like tally stones, finger bones wrapped in linen and marked with miniature prayers so small you'd need a magnifying lens to read them. You have entered the domain of the bone scribes, a secret priesthood so hidden, so strange, that for most of history it was believed to be a legend dot, but they were real, and they wrote their sacred texts on themselves. The bone scribes were not temple priests. They didn't chant at altars or lead festivals. They worked beneath the surface, both literally and spiritually assigned, to the funerary orders that dealt with death's lingering messiness. Forgotten corpses, unsolved deaths, unquiet spirits, where most priests honored the dead with incense. And song, the bone scribes did something darker. They listened to the dead, not symbolically, not metaphorically, literally. They believed the unburied, or improperly mourned, still whispered secrets, regrets, curses, and most importantly, information. Stories that would otherwise be lost. Names that history would erase. The bone scribes saw themselves as archivists of the forgotten, but parchment decayed. Stone could be stolen. So they developed a new method. They made themselves the archive. Once initiated, a bone scribe would begin the lifelong ritual of etching, using fine copper tools to carve tiny hieroglyphs into their bones, often during controlled periods of fasting and altered consciousness. The writing wasn't decorative. It wasn't meant to be seen. In fact, most of it was never visible until after death. The process was agonizing. The outer layer of skin would be peeled back or punctured repeatedly. The bone cleaned, carved, and treated with protective oils. The wounds stitched. The skin would scar over, hiding the words again. Each carving held something. A name of a forgotten child drowned in the Nile, the final breath of a widow who died alone, the dream of a farmer buried outside the Holy Land. And the scribes didn't choose what to write. They claimed the dead told them. Usually at night, the rituals were strange and solitary. The scribe would lie atop an old grave, sometimes for hours, chanting low tones and inhaling dried blue lotus. If a whisper came soft and sudden, Not from within, but beside. The priest would rise, record what he heard on a wax tablet, then later transcribe it onto his own ribs, or spine dot to outsiders. This was madness dot to the scribes. It was mercy. They believed each soul unrecorded was a soul at risk of erasure, of eternal wandering, of being lost in the darkness beyond do it. They were feared, of course, even among other priesthoods. Most temples refused to house them. They built their own crypts, worked alone, and rarely appeared in daylight. When they did, they wore layered robes and hoods, not from shame, but to keep the whispers out. Some wore copper masks, lined with scripture. Others placed wax in their ears to silence the voices when not in ritual. There are even accounts of scribes who carved prayers into their skulls before death, hoping to carry protection into the afterlife. A few surviving bone fragments have been uncovered, some at Abydos, others near forgotten tombs in Atmim. Radiographs revealed legible glyphs etched into femurs and shoulder blades. Translations speak of flood victims, murdered priests, children buried without names. One passage reads, asterisk, he begged to be remembered, so I carry him. Asterisk, there is no signature. No claim of authorship, only the bone. Only the vow, and so the bone. Scribes continued for generations unknown, unseen, uncelebrated. They did not build pyramids. They left no temples. But they carried a library beneath their skin. And as you picture them now, sitting by candlelight, blade in hand, bone-exposed, you may wonder, who decides what is worth remembering? And what if the dead are still waiting to be heard? They were quiet men, always quiet. The bone scribes walked like smoke, entering tombs no one else dared approach. They worked at night or in shaded crypts, away from the sound of bells and the warmth of sun. Their presence brought an unspoken tension people stepped aside for them, not out of reverence, but discomfort. Not because of how they looked, most hid their scars beneath heavy robes, but because of what they carried. A living archive. You see, over time, a bone scribe's body became a walking library filled not with stories of kings or victories, but with the most human of records. Final thoughts, unfinished wishes, whispered regrets. Every notch in a rib, every scratch along a collarbone, was a sentence saved from oblivion. And because these inscriptions were hidden beneath flesh, the scribes became sacred objects themselves. They were not touched, not embraced, not even mourned in the traditional way. To touch a scribe was to risk becoming part of the archive yourself. There are scattered stories of those who tried in one tale. A grieving widow begged a scribe to carve her dead husband's final words onto her own bones so she could feel him within. He refused. She tried again the next month, and the next. On the third visit, she brought a copper chisel and tried to carve them herself. The scribe stopped her, but gently. He whispered something into her ear, and she never returned. Another story, written on the wall of a desert tomb, tells of a scribe who had filled every inch of his body with inscriptions. Even his fingers were carved, each joint a ledger of forgotten names. With no space left, he stopped eating, stopped speaking, and lay on a slab of cold stone. It was said he asked to be buried upright, so his spine would point toward the sky to the scribes. Death was not an end, but a final entry. Their bones were never burned, never broken, never removed from the sacred ground. After death, other scribes would exhume the body, clean it reverently, and prepare it for display, though not in public. The bones were placed in deep vaults, organized by region, century, and type of death. Some vaults contained only rib cages. Others, only skulls etched with silent cries. These were the chambers of the forgotten. Only scribes were allowed inside. There, in the deepest parts of the temple crypts, they would walk among their predecessors, consulting the bones when questions arose. Did someone once die in this village during the plague? Check the femur shelf. Was there once a child who drowned here, long before the Nile shifted its course? Consult the pelvis row dot. It sounds absurd, but the records worked, because the scribes didn't lie. They didn't embellish. They didn't judge. They remembered. And in doing so, they became something more than men. Not saints. Not martyrs. Carriers. They didn't ask to be followed. They left no schools. But sometimes one would pass through a town, and someone, usually a child, would feel it. Not fear. Not awe. But recognition dot, as if they knew that. One day, their own name might be written somewhere. Not in a book. Not on a wall, but in someone else's body. And centuries later, long after the temples fell, when archaeologists uncovered unmarked graves with ribs inscribed in hieroglyphs, no one had ever catalogued, they realized these were not criminals, not outcasts. They were librarians. And though their words are faded and their bones scattered, a question still lingers. If every soul is a story, how many of them are still waiting for someone to carry them? At some point, the practice had to end, not because the bone scribes were driven out, or hunted, or condemned, but because time itself grew too loud. The temples crumbled, the scrolls were lost, and the whispers of the dead, those delicate, dusk-born murmurs, were drowned out by conquest and noise and empire. But before it ended, something unexpected happened. A scribe returned with a warning. His name is unknown, but fragments of his ribs were found in a buried jar near Medinet Habu. The inscriptions were tight, desperate, written in a shorthand no other scribe ever used. One phrase repeated across several bones, etched into the marrow line. Asterisk, the names no longer stay still. Asterisk, what did he mean? The bone scribes believed that once inscribed, a soul's memory would rest, that the dead would be settled, anchored by the act of being remembered. But this scribe, who had traveled far, deeper into tombs than most dared, claimed that some of the names began to shift. Not physically, but spiritually. Dot whispers once clear grew distorted. Regrets repeated themselves in loops. New voices appeared. With no bodies attached, Dot, it was as if the archive had become haunted by itself. The scribe wrote that some bones began to speak before he touched them, that he heard stories from the long dead, but also from those not yet born. One line deeply etched across a vertebra reads, Asterisk, a girl cries by a machine of light. She is not yet real. Asterisk, was this madness? Prophecy? Symbolism? No one knows. But shortly after recording these fragments, he vanished. No tomb, no burial. Only the jar of bones, found centuries later beneath a collapsed wall. After that, the bone scribes began to fade, not because they were discredited, but because they were complete. Their task was never to last forever. It was to hold memory until the world was ready to carry it. Another way, Dot, and perhaps it was. Some scholars believe the rise of funerary texts, the growing popularity of the Book of the Dead, was the natural successor to the bone scribes, a way to move memory into something more universal. Others say the scribes still exist, but in different forms. A quiet worker who carries names in a notebook they never share. A tattoo artist who refuses to design anything unless it means something lost. Or maybe they're gone, but the bones remain. In museums, mislabeled, in ossuaries, in caves, in forgotten corners of the desert, where wind uncovers fragments and jackal's paws, as if listening. And still today, deep within your own ribs, you can feel something ancient, the soft rhythm of memory. The weight of forgotten names, the sense that your own body might one day become a vessel. And maybe, just maybe, that's all that bone scribes ever wanted, not to be remembered, but to teach us how to remember others, even when the world forgets. 7. The ash tenders, it's just before dawn, and you're standing in a chamber that smells of smoke, resin, and something older like dust soaked in time. There's no wind here. The air is still and dry. In the center of the room is a fire pit, sunken into a polished stone basin. It's not roaring. It doesn't flicker brightly. But it burns, it always burns. This is the Temple of Eternal Flame, a place where a fire has been burning for longer than anyone alive can remember. It is not symbolic. It is not decorative. It is alive, and it is watched by the ash tenders priests, who have devoted their entire lives to a single, impossible task. Don't let it die. They were called by different names depending on the region. Kedet and Sejim, keepers of the heat, or Hetpu Nefertu, calm makers of the flame. But they all served the same purpose, to guard and maintain specific sacred fires believed to house the breath of gods. These weren't cooking fires or funeral pyres. They were elemental relics ignited during specific planetary alignments or lightning strikes or buried solar eclipses, and once lit, were considered vessels of divine essence. Not metaphorically. Literally, to let one die was to invite disorder. Not just in the temple, but in the world. The ash tenders knew this. They didn't rest. They worked in rotations, 3 at a time. One watched, one cleaned, one slept nearby, just barely. No one left the chamber without replacement. Fires were transferred from one basin to another, only through sacred. Flame cradles, long copper tongs passed hand to hand in silence. Even the ash was sacred. Each morning, the cooled ash from the previous night was collected and weighed. If too much had accumulated, it meant the fire had not burned cleanly, perhaps a sign of impurity. If too little, it meant the fire had drawn too much from the air, perhaps a warning. The ashes were then mixed with oil or ground stone and used in temple inks, cosmetics for statues, or healing balms. But sometimes the ash was buried. You see, not all fires were cooperative. Most of the time, the flame was calm, steadily burning, low and constant. But there are records, tucked in soot-stained ledgers of nights, when the flame twisted upward without warning, turned black, split in two. Once, it hissed so violently, the tenders thought it had spoken. They called that night the breath of Sekhmet, and fasted for 9 days afterward. Another record mentions a flame that refused to catch light during a transition ceremony. 3 times they brought the sacred tongs. 3 times the new basin remained cold. Only after reciting an obscure hymn one not sung for over a century did the fire move. Was it superstition? Maybe. Or maybe these priests had come to recognize a rhythm in the flame of personality. They believed the fire was not an object, but a guest, a being, one that needed care, attention, patience, and the tending became a relationship. Priests grew old beside this fire. They learned to speak to it in tones. Some sang to it softly during the late hours. Others confessed secrets to the embers, believing the flame carried their words upward to the gods. One priest reportedly kept a detailed journal of the flame's moods, its height, its color, its scent, describing it as a kind of temple, heartbeat. He died beside it, peacefully. Ashes dusted over his fingertips. There was no punishment, no scandal. He had kept the fire alive. That was all that mattered, And when the new apprentice arrived, he didn't ask questions. He took the tongs, stepped into the heat, and began to watch, because he understood. This was not a ritual. This was ***, promise ***. And as you sit now, beside the same low burning flame, hearing nothing but the soft crackle and the breath of stone. Walls, you may wonder, what happens when your whole life is devoted not to changing the world, but to keeping a single spark alive? The fire is older than the priest tending it, older than his teacher, older than the bricks in the floor, perhaps even older than the temple itself. And it's still burning. It hasn't gone out. Not once. Not in storms. Not in sand whipping. Winds, not even during the famine when there was no wood for days, and the tenders burned their own sandals, papyrus scrolls, and oil-soaked linen strips to feed it. Just kept going. And that is what haunts the ash tenders more than anything else, not fear that it might die, but the mystery of why it won't. You see, the fire was never supposed to burn this long. According to an early inscription on the temple's inner walls, this particular flame was lit to honor a celestial alignment that occurred once every 780 years. The intention was to let it burn for 7 days, then extinguish it, bottle a fragment in sacred resin, and bury it. But on the 7th day, something strange happened. When they tried to smother the flame, it resisted. Literally. The moment the flame cover was placed over the basin, it cracked in two. Then the tongs, wrapped in soaked linen, to pinch the embers closed, snapped like dry reeds. One of the senior priests fell unconscious. The other's fingers were burned black, though the fire hadn't touched them. They called off the ritual, and the flame was left alone. That was over 400 years ago. Since then, it has never been extinguished. And the ash tenders never tried again. Instead, they began to document the fire itself, not just its maintenance, but its behavior. Logs recorded in meticulous handwriting detail. Every moment the flame flickered blue, spat without cause, or dropped. Low despite fresh fuel. The most consistent observation was this: the flame responded to presence. When left alone, it dimmed. When approached by a devoted priest, it grew stronger. Some called it coincidence. Others called it communion. A text from the late Ptolemaic period reads, *, we thought we served it, but it listens, and it waits. *1 tender, a man named Panezi, reportedly spent 37 years by the fire. He married no one, took no apprentices. He simply watched, fed it carefully, whispered to it as if it were a child. When he died, his body was cremated not in the temple's funerary pit, but in the sacred basin itself. For the first time, the flame roared, not in anger. In acceptance. After that, cremation became forbidden. Panezi was the last. And yet, even as the rituals changed, the flame endured. Through regime shifts, through temple closings, through drought, through plague, the outside world forgot. But in that one chamber, a light continued. Modern scholars argue about its existence. Some claim it was a metaphor. Others say it's impossible. Fire cannot burn that long without maintenance, rebuilding, replacement. But they're not wrong. The fire was maintained. Day after day. Night after night. By hands no one remembers. One priest wrote shortly before his death, *, the gods do not demand miracles, only continuity. And that is what the ash tenders embodied. Not brilliance, not conquest, not dramatic. Prophecy. Just the quiet courage to keep something alive. To feed it, to guard it, to not walk away even when no one's watching. And now you're here, beside that same flame. It dances, slow and soft, like it recognizes you, like it's remembering something. And maybe you're remembering something too. Promise. A spark. Something small but essential. Something that refuses to die. Even now, it happened quietly. There was no storm, no war, no earthquake or divine punishment. Just time unfolding, as it always does, without urgency or memory. One day, the temple was full. The next, it wasn't. The ash tenders had grown. Old, their apprentices had not returned. The scrolls lay untouched. And in the inner sanctum, the sacred fire still alive burned alone. That final priest, his name long lost, tended it as best he could. His journal, later found sealed in oilcloth, recorded his failing hands, his weakening legs, his struggle to keep the flame fed. He described the way the fire seemed to sense it too, how it dimmed slightly, not in anger, but in preparation. His final entry was not poetic, not desperate, just 5 words. Asterisk, it will remember me anyway. Asterisk, and then. No more writing. The flame likely burned for several days after that, perhaps longer. No one knows exactly when it went out. By the time travelers came through that region again, the temple was buried under sand. The basin was cold. The tongs rusted. The ash ... scattered. But here's what's strange. When archaeologists uncovered the chamber centuries later, they found no soot in the basin. No burn marks. No carbon residue. The stone was smooth. Impossibly smooth. As if the fire had never been there. Or perhaps had always been there, and left only the memory of heat. A memory that lingered, because even in silence, some visitors claimed to feel warmth in the air, a kind of presence, as if something was still waiting, very patiently, to be fed. Maybe that's what the ash tenders believed too. That fire was not just chemical, not just wood and spark, but a kind of soul. And that their job was never to control it. Just to tend it. Gently, faithfully, quietly. And perhaps, in some way, that fire still lives. In the stories we pass down. In the kindness we repeat. In the tiny acts of care no one sees, but that keeps something vital from going dark. And maybe that's the true legacy of the ash tenders. Not the flame itself, but the idea that something sacred is worth preserving, even if no one remembers why, even if the world forgets, even if all that's left is ash, still warm. 8. The sleep watcher's room is dim and still. You're seated on a reed mat, knees drawn close, facing a low sleeping pallet made of palm slats. A flickering oil lamp sends long shadows dancing across the clay walls. Outside, the sounds of the village have faded into night. No footsteps, no water jars clinking, no birdsong. Only breathing. Faint, labored breathing. And beside that bed sits a man older, wrapped in white linen, his face gentle but unreadable. He holds a small bundle of incense twigs in one hand and a smooth, rounded stone in the other. He is not a relative, not a physician. He is a sleep watcher, a priest trained not to heal, but to accompany the dying. These priests didn't perform last rites. They didn't anoint or embalm. They didn't pray aloud. Their purpose was simpler, more intimate. To sit. To stay. To witness. The tradition began in the temples of Hathor, goddess of love, music, and peaceful death. But it spread quietly to remote villages and family homes, wherever someone faced their final hours in solitude or pain. A family might send for a sleep watcher when they knew death was near. His presence was not considered a sign of doom, but a kindness. He brought no tools, no scrolls, just stillness. You see, in ancient Egyptian belief, the soul, Ka, could become disoriented during death, confused by pain, fear, or unfinished attachments. If a person died in chaos, they might not transition cleanly to the duat, the underworld. They might linger, lost, neither here nor there. The sleep watcher's job was to prevent that. By holding space, by offering calm, being a fixed presence in the unsteady moment between life and elsewhere. He would enter the home quietly, bow slightly to the dying, and take his place on the mat. From that moment, he would not leave, not for water, not for food, not even for rest until the final breath passed. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were always slow, rehearsed, and comforting. Lines passed down over generations. Asterisk, I am here. You are not alone. The door is open. Your name will not be lost. Asterisk, he would watch the body closely, not with a physician's eye, but a spiritual one. He listened not for signs of survival, but for peace. If the dying stirred, he placed a calming hand on their forearm. Not tight, just enough to say, "I remain." If the breath changed, he matched his own to theirs, so they would not feel adrift. If the eyes opened in fear, he was the first thing they saw. And the last, some said the sleep watchers absorbed fragments of the soul like soft sponges, carrying them briefly until the gods could receive them. Others believed they were like stones placed in a river, steadying the current so the crossing could be smooth. Not everyone requested them. Some died in noise or silence, but those who did often passed more gently. Their bodies relaxed. Their breathing slowed naturally, as if, in the presence of someone who expected nothing and feared nothing, the Ka felt safe enough to leave. Sleep watchers were not celebrated. They had no titles. They left no monuments. Often, their names weren't even recorded, but families remembered them. So did the midwives, the weavers, the elderly, the orphans, because they were always there when no one else could be. And now, as you sit on this mat beside the flickering lamp, the final breaths grow shallower. The oil burns lower. Watcher doesn't flinch. He breathes in rhythm. He places the stone gently beside the hand of the dying, and as the final exhale drifts into the air like smoke, he leans close and whispers, "Asterisk, you may rest now that you are not forgotten." Asterisk, and that is the end dot, but not of the story. Because in the silence that follows, something always lingers. A presence, a memory, a whisper that someone stayed until the very last moment. The breathing is stopped, not suddenly, not sharply, just faded, like the light of a setting moon. The room still smells faintly of warm skin, linen, and sandalwood smoke. The lamp flickers once, then steadies. The silence is deep. No, not empty, but full, like a held breath that will never return. The sleep watcher remains seated. He does not rise. He does not speak. He lets the silence settle. This is part of the ritual, because the moment of death, in this tradition, is not a line but a slope, a soft descent. To declare it, would be to interrupt a process the soul may still be completing. There is a belief among sleep watchers that even after the last breath, the spirit hovers for a short while near the body, near the watcher, perhaps, unsure whether it has been seen. A proper farewell is not for the living to hear. It's for the dead to feel dot, and so the watcher waits. He arranges the limbs gently, never with haste. He places the smooth river stone, used for centuries to anchor departing souls, onto the chest of the departed. It is cool, weighty, grounding dot then, and only then. He speaks the end line, a phrase used only once in each watcher's career, for each soul they accompany. It varies slightly, but always includes the same core message. Asterisk, you are witnessed. You are remembered. You go forward in peace. Asterisk, there is no rush to alert the family. No announcement. The watcher steps outside and places a palm-sized reed token on the lintel of the home, a symbol known to the village, shaped like an open. Eye turned sideways. It means the soul has gone. Then he returns to the body. He does not fear it. He sits a while longer, this time for himself, because the watcher must also release dot. To sit through someone's final hours is to absorb something: grief, love, fear, acceptance. It does not pass through you without leaving a mark. Some say the watchers carry dozens of such imprints in their bones. They often walk slowly, speak gently, sleep lightly. They are full of partings, and they are trained to carry them without breaking. Training to become a sleep watcher was not about ritual knowledge. It was about capacity. Candidates were chosen not for intelligence, but for presence. Could they sit in silence for hours without needing to fill it? Could they look into the eyes of the dying and not turn away? Could they bear witness without absorbing the pain as their own? Many failed. Those who passed were assigned a mentor, an elder, watcher who would bring them to real deaths, first to observe, then to share, then to lead. The final test came unannounced. A quiet nod, a last breath, a life placed in their hands to honor. There are no texts describing what the soul sees in its final moments. But watchers are taught that their face may be the last face a person ever sees. Their voice may be the last sound heard. Their calm, their breath, their stillness that becomes the bridge. They are the boatmen of silence, and they are rarely thanked. Often, they leave without a word. No payment, no feast, just a nod. And then they walk to the next village, carrying only a small pouch of incense, a fresh linen wrap, and the memory of the one they just let go. Some watchers keep records. Not names, but moments. One scroll, found sealed inside a reed box in an abandoned shrine, contained nothing but brief lines like, asterisk, he smiled just before. Asterisk, asterisk, the candle went out on its own. Asterisk, asterisk, she waited for her daughter, then exhaled. Asterisk tiny, fragments of lives passing gently dot, and perhaps that's the lesson the sleepwatchers left behind, not in grand teachings, but in stillness. That dying is not an error, not a failure dot, it is a process dot, and if someone is there to hold the edge, it can be a beautiful one. The sun has risen. Pale light slips through the reed shutters, casting a soft lattice across the floor. Outside, life resumes footsteps, the distant bray of a donkey, the creak of a water wheel. But inside the home, time still lingers at the edge of the final. Breath. The sleepwatcher gathers his few belongings. He folds the reed mat where he sat, as if closing a book. He checks the placement of the stone on the chest-centered, still. The body will be tended soon by family or embalmers, but for now, it is his responsibility. One final glance. One last breath of stillness dot, and then he leaves. There is no trail of incense behind him. No crowd, no announcement. Just footsteps in sand, light, steady, forgotten by some, unseen by others. But for one person, for the one who passed, he was everything in that final moment, and that was enough. What makes the sleepwatchers so remarkable is not just what they did, but what they refused to do. They refused to rush, to look away, to flinch, to fill the silence with noise or stories or prayers not meant for them. They offered no comfort that wasn't real, no promise they couldn't keep. Just this, I am here. I will stay. You will not go alone. Some cultures built pyramids to honor the dead. Others carved names into stone, erected statues, held processions. But the watchers knew that presence true, wordless presence, was its own kind of monument. The dead they accompanied were not always kings or scribes. Many were nameless, beggars, outcasts, midwives, children, slaves. It didn't matter. The watcher came for anyone who needed him. That was the vow dot, and the vow was kept, even as the temples closed, even as new beliefs rose and swept the land. Even as memory itself began to fail dot, there are fragments of their existence, hidden in unexpected places. A faint hieroglyph in the corner of a tomb mural, showing a seated figure beside a bed. A faded amulet bearing the symbol for watcher of last breath. A line in a funerary hymn. Asterisk, may your crossing be seen. Asterisk, but no full record survives. That was never the point. The sleepwatchers did not serve eternity. They served moments, sacred, fleeting moments at the end of time for each person. They were there not to extend life, but to dignify its final act. And perhaps that's the secret they carried, passed from elder to apprentice, from watcher to watcher. That in the very last hour, what matters is not status or story, or even belief. It's being seen. It's knowing someone stayed with you, that someone bore witness as the world let go. And so, as the watcher disappears down a narrow path beside the river, his robes catching the first morning wind, something remains in the home. Behind him, not a soul, not a sound, but a stillness that feels full. Finished. Whole. And perhaps one day, when your own last breath draws near, you won't be afraid, because someone somewhere may be watching. Not to save you, not to judge you, but simply to say, asterisk, I saw you leave. You are not alone. Asterisk to 9. The wind counters its early morning in the desert. The horizon is painted with a soft gray-blue light, and the wind is already awake, brushing sand across stone, rattling reeds, stirring the linen of a single man who stands very still at the temple's edge. He isn't praying. He isn't sweeping or preparing incense. He is holding a bundle of woven feathers, suspended from a string, perfectly balanced. His eyes are half closed. His breathing slow. He is counting wind. This is not poetry. This is his job. He is a wind counter, a member of one of the quietest and least understood priestly orders of ancient Egypt. Their temple halls contained no roaring crowds, no cymbals or gongs. Their altars bore no blood, no statues. Their worship was conducted in silence. Their god had no name. They followed the movement. The belief was simple. The gods did not only speak through visions, or fire, or dreams, but through motion. Subtle, atmospheric, environmental motion. A sudden breeze in a sealed corridor. The tilt of a flame without draft. A curtain shifting on a windless day. The wind counters trained to observe these signs, to record, to interpret, and most curiously, to measure them. Not with tools as we know them. They had no gauges or compasses. Their instruments were feathers, oils, sand, smoke, and instinct. And time, lots of time. They would sit for hours in specially constructed chambers, circular stone rooms with high walls and narrow slits for air. To enter, in the center of each chamber was a tall copper staff, topped with a floating spindle, from which hung delicate threads attached to feathers, papyrus tassels, or polished beads. The goal, to record the slightest movement. They charted directions, angles, rhythm, and duration. A 3-second flutter from the south during the 3rd hour of daylight might mean one thing. A slow spiral clockwise at dusk might mean another. But they didn't interpret the movements as weather. They saw them as messages. Messages from gods whose presence could not be captured in form, only in influence. Some believed they served the hidden aspects of Amun, the invisible one. Others thought they communed with Mat herself, the goddess of balance, whose presence was felt most keenly, not in grand acts, but in the gentle restoration of stillness after motion. Whatever the theology, the wind counters took their roles seriously. Each movement was recorded in scrolls, known as the breath logs, delicate, long sheets of papyrus filled with symbols for direction, pressure, temperature, and sensation. Not every entry contained an interpretation. Often they simply wrote, asterisk, a shift came. I acknowledged it. Asterisk, but some logs describe more. One speaks of a chamber where the air began to spin for no reason, no windows open, no weather change. A visiting priest collapsed moments later, overcome by dizziness and memory. Another describes a low corridor in a ruined temple where, at the same hour every week, a gust of air would move against the known wind, always the same direction, always the same duration. The wind counters didn't claim to understand these events. They didn't try to explain the wind. They tried to listen, and listening for them wasn't passive. It was devotional. It required stillness, discipline, a body so attuned that the shift of one breath could signal an omen. Some wind counters trained by meditating with strips of cloth draped over their skin, learning to feel the difference Between a breeze from the east and one from the southeast, with their eyes closed, there were even advanced practitioners who could predict ritual disruptions, broken vessels, sudden deaths, or failed crops days before they occurred, based only on a subtle change in wind dot. And yet, they never predicted for kings, never issued oracles. Their service was to the air itself, not to politics or power. They lived alone, often on the outskirts of temple complexes. Their quarters were built with precision aligned with specific airflow channels, free of clutter and covered in dust. They never swept, so they could track footprints and breeze trails. They did not fast. They did not chant, but they were among the most revered by the inner priesthood, because they knew what others didn't, that the divine didn't always shout. Sometimes it moved. And you, now standing in one of their old chambers, the sand, brushing softly at your ankles, a feather swaying ever so slightly on its thread, you begin to understand. This wasn't superstition, it was sensitivity. And maybe, just maybe, something is moving in the stillness, something you were never taught to notice. The chamber is so quiet, you can hear the feather breathe. It sways on its thread, barely and elegant, deliberate motion that almost feels intentional. No wind, no door opened, no footstep. But the feather knows something has shifted. The wind counter records it. One stroke on a narrow strip of linen, soaked in ochre pigment, then dried in the corner of the room where the air is always still. He doesn't write a conclusion. He doesn't need to. The movement is enough. This is the difference between the wind counters and everyone else. Where others saw randomness, gusts, heat, shimmers, drifting ash, they saw patterns, messages, influence, divine fingerprints, brushed across the skin of the world. They trained their whole lives for this. Not to master nature, but to attune themselves to it. Initiation began not with rituals, but with stillness. A novice wind counter would sit for 7 days in an open-air courtyard. No food, no fire, no walls, only the wind and the sand. If he fidgeted, he failed. If he panicked when the air grew still, he was dismissed. Only those who learned to listen without anticipation were invited into the inner chambers. There, they learned the art of flow, a system of subtle geometry used to interpret invisible lines of motion. Not quite science, not quite magic. A mapping of invisible pressure. A horizontal gust from the east intersecting with an updraft from below could, for example, signal a shift in the Nile's temperament. Not a flood, just a mood. Wind counters believed the Nile itself breathed, not in tides, but in pulses. And they recorded these pulses through reed streamers planted in the riverbanks. The direction and tension of the reeds were charted, logged, and compared to the movement of stars, bird migrations, and temple disturbances. One astonishing record, found in a limestone vault near the Valley of the Queens, charts an instance in which 3 wind counters, operating miles apart, recorded identical spiraling movements in their chambers. That same night, a fire broke out in a storehouse for funerary oils, a disaster that could have decimated preparations for several elite burials. They believed the wind warned them. Others scoffed. They always had. But here's what made the wind counters so unusual. They expected to be ignored, but they didn't chase acclaim. They never engraved their names. Even their scrolls were unsigned, always attributed to the movement, never the man. And so their knowledge remained fragile, passed hand to hand, generation to generation. In windswept chambers and hollowed stone hollows. One master wind counter, known only by the glyph for still tree, reportedly went 13 years without speaking. When asked how he taught his students, a temple scribe replied, asterisk, he exhaled. Differently, that was enough. Asterisk, even in death, wind counters remained understated. Their burial chambers had no paintings, just 4 slits cut carefully into the stone, allowing air to pass through. A feather was suspended above the tomb, and if it ever swayed unnaturally, the watchers took it as a sign that the departed priest still listened. One such feather, ancient, brittle, mostly dust, was found during an excavation at Kam Umbu. It had been tied with a single thread of gold hair. No inscriptions, just a single glyph carved into the wall beside it. Asterisk, I heard you. Asterisk, perhaps that's all they ever wanted, to be the ones who heard, who noticed, who bore witness to the movements. Too small for others to see. And maybe the gods liked it that way. Maybe they still speak not in thunder, not in stone, not even in dreams, but in the turn of dust, the shift of a curtain, the flicker of a candle. And maybe, if you slow down just enough, if you sit in a still room with a single feather, and wait, you'll feel it too. Something moving through you, around you, for you, a message or a memory, or maybe just breath. By the end, there was only one chamber left. The great temples had fallen silent, the festivals gone, the processions stilled. Sand had overtaken the courtyards, and no priests remained to sweep the thresholds clean. But beneath one forgotten structure half swallowed by the desert was a chamber that still whispered. They called it the temple that breathed, not because of any machinery, or magic, or even mystery, at least not in the way scholars would later assume, but because of its air. The chamber had been constructed with uncanny precision. Narrow slits positioned according to ancient astronomical calculations, grooves in the stone shaped to guide desert wind through in curving, gentle flows. The sound was almost imperceptible, like a sigh, but constant. You could sit in the center of the chamber and feel it move past your cheeks, your shoulders, your fingertips. A breath that never stopped. And for a long time, someone always sat there, not to worship, not to study, but to listen. The last wind counter, his name unknown, his body never found, was said to have lived the final years of his life in that chamber, long after the outer temple was abandoned. He brought no scrolls, just his staff, his threads, his feathers. Every morning, he woke with the wind. Every night, he fell asleep to its rhythm. He wrote nothing, not on papyrus, not on stone, but archaeologists found his breath logged not in writing, but in objects. 37. Feathers, each weighted with a tiny clay bead, arranged in a spiral across the floor. Each had been tied with a different kind of thread, flax, silk, palm fiber, even hair. No two were alike. And when the wind passed through the chamber, the spiral moved not as chaos, but as choreography, like a language. One that no one has ever been able to read, but one that was clearly meant to be read. A quiet script, written not in ink, but in movement. And perhaps that's what the wind counters understood more deeply than any of us, that not all knowledge is spoken, or written, or even seen. Some truths drift by. They ripple a curtain, they shift a feather, they cool the skin. Just before a dream, they come and go, and we are meant only to notice. Before the chamber was sealed again, the team found one final artifact tucked behind a stone ledge, a slip of linen wrapped around a thread of gold tied to a reed stylus. Burned into the linen with powdered charcoal was a simple phrase. Asterisk, he left no sound, only stillness. Asterisk, and so the story ends not with revelation, but with quiet. No prophecy. No thunder. Just a room that breathes. And maybe, on certain nights, when the wind passes through your own space-rustling curtains, brushing past your ears, you'll remember that someone long ago was listening and maybe still is. 10. The water tasters are standing on the edge of the Nile just before dawn. The water is still dark, tinted by moonlight and silt. Birds sleep in the papyrus groves. The wind is warm. And next to you, priest kneels with a clay bowl and a flat-tipped reed. He dips it into the river with great care, not to draw water, but but to gather something more specific. Taste, not for thirst. Not for health. But for divination. This is a water taster one of a highly specialized priestly order whose job, for nearly 1,000 years, was not to control the Nile or map its floods, but to read its mood, not by looking, not by measuring. By tasting. The idea may sound strange to us now in a world of data and instruments. But to the water tasters, the Nile was not just a river. It was a living being, an extension of the divine body of Hapi, the god of inundation and fertility. And like any living being, it had moods, seasons, even emotions. And like any emotion, it could be tasted. The water tasters trained to detect changes in the Nile with their tongues. They were not checking for minerals or bacteria, though. Unknowingly, they sometimes did. What they tasted for was meaning. A metallic sharpness might mean anger, a sour tinge, a warning. A strange sweetness, rare and fleeting, might signal a blessing. A muddy bitterness often preceded failed harvests. And sometimes there was no taste at all. That was the worst of all. A tasteless Nile meant a withdrawn god. The water tasters didn't sip. They used reed straws to gather surface water, mid-depth water, and near-bottom sediment, all tasted in a specific order. The ritual was slow, meditative. They rolled the water over their tongues, closed their eyes, and waited for the sensation to settle, not just on the tongue, but in the chest. They trained for years to detect subtleties, learning to separate sediment from salt, algae from silt, decay from divine presence. Their palates were sensitive beyond comprehension. One initiate was said to have tasted the difference between Nile water touched by sunrise versus moonlight. And they didn't taste once. They tasted every day. Same spot, same hour, just before sunrise. Scrolls found in buried stone jars near Elephantine contain pages and pages of water notes, brackish today, like copper stirred into milk, or sharpness in the east current, faint sweetness in the south, bitterness near the delta. The notes were often poetic, even cryptic, but other priests relied on them. Farmers waited for the taster's words before planting. Temple astrologers compared water moods to planetary alignments. Healers used them to predict waves of illness. When the Nile tasted wrong, everything stopped. One record speaks of a year when the water taster declared the river had become unknowable. No taste, no message, just silence. The priests delayed a coronation. Markets closed. Travelers returned home. The entire country paused for 3 days. Then the taste returned, muddy with silver. The people moved forward. Not every taster was revered. Some were feared, because to taste the Nile was to know too much. One tale half myth, half buried record tells of a taster who predicted his own death 6 days before it happened. "There is blood in the north flow," he said, "and my name is in it." He refused food, walked into the river, and vanished. His bowl was later found at the delta, coated in dark sediment. The taste, reportedly, was bitter as papyrus roots. Still, the practice continued, quietly, faithfully. The water tasters did not shout. They didn't declare oracles. They whispered to temple scribes, who then passed the word up the chain. They understood their place, not center, but source. And so they tasted, day after day, sometimes salt, sometimes dust, sometimes, when the Nile was angry, blood. And when asked why they did it, not for glory or power or wealth, they always gave the same answer. Asterisk, the river speaks. I listen with my tongue. Asterisk, and now, as you kneel at the riverbank, the priest offers you the bowl. You dip the reed. The water is cool. You sip. And for a moment, it tastes like metal and earth and rain and something else, something living. And maybe, just maybe, you hear it, the mood of a god drifting on your breath. The river doesn't speak in words, it never has. But for those who learned how to listen with their tongues, it could say everything of droughts and floods, of forgotten, offerings of cities too bold, and kings too afraid. And sometimes it said nothing at all. That was when the water tasters grew afraid. There is a log, preserved on water-hardened papyrus, pulled from the silt near a Siyat, that describes what came to be known as the Week of Blind Taste. In it, a senior taster writes, asterisk, we drew from the west bank and found no message. We drew from the center and found no presence. We tasted the depth and found only water, not silence. Not peace, absence, double quotes, asterisk. The priests tried again at dusk, again at moonrise, again before dawn. The Nile remained blank. For a tradition built on nuance and trace sensations, this was not just an absence of taste, it was a rupture, like a beloved voice suddenly hollow, not angry, not cruel, but distant. The taster did what had only been done 3 times in recorded history. He refused to speak. For 7 days, he offered no interpretation, no guidance, just silence. A temple stopped its harvest rituals. Priests paused funerary preparations. Builders halted their work on a shrine's expansion, leaving their tools still in the sand. When the taster finally returned, he wore a wreath of faded lotus. His voice was dry. His verdict, asterisk, the river no longer listens to us. We must listen harder. Asterisk, what followed was a new phase of the tradition. Depth tasting. You see, the original water tasters had focused on surface waters, easy to reach, closest to the gods. But now they turned to the deep bends in the Nile, to the dark eddies under cliff shadows, and the old tributaries fed by underground springs. These waters were harder to access, slower, sometimes warmer, sometimes cold as stone. But the taster believed these were the dreams of the river, what it muttered to itself beneath the surface. And in time, the taste returned sour at first, then oily, then metallic, like coins pressed into the tongue, and finally, something strange. One record calls it asterisk, earth bitter, with a pulse of honey. The taster declared it a delayed omen, something long promised, long ignored, finally arriving. That year, rains came early. The Nile rose in a perfect rare flood. The granaries overflowed, but that wasn't the only thing the taste foretold. Another taster further north described an aftertaste barely there. Dry, clay-like, like walls. He interpreted it as a sign of coming obstruction. The next year, several irrigation canals collapsed under their own sediment. How did he know? He didn't. He tasted. But water tasters did not treat their insight as absolute. They always left room for misinterpretation. One scroll includes this humble line, asterisk, perhaps it was only salt, or perhaps a god I did not know was passing through. Asterisk, they acknowledged what we so often forget, that mystery is not always a failure. Sometimes it is fidelity, a sign that what we serve is larger than what we can grasp. The taster's role was never about control. It was relationship, and like all relationships, it required humility, repetition, patience. Some tasters were known to fast before certain sips. Others whispered to the water before tasting, as if asking permission. One old taster, blind in both eyes, was said to have known the entire river by taste alone, from Elephantine to the Delta. He claimed the water grew younger the closer it came to the sea, and maybe he was right, because to them, water wasn't just resource. It was mood, memory, moment. A god in motion. A body of wisdom so vast, it could only be absorbed 1 drop at a time. And maybe that's why the taster's task was never finished. Even after years, decades, lifetimes of sipping, they never stopped asking, asterisk, what are you trying to tell me now? Asterisk, it ends as it began in silence, not because the Nile ran dry, not because the gods grew angry, but because people stopped tasting, not all at once, slowly. One generation, then the next, new methods came. Measuring sticks, flood gauges, administrative schedules. The taster's reed bowl became a curiosity, the daily sip a relic, the river still sacred, but now managed, mapped, and eventually ignored. The last known water taster is unnamed in history. His reed bowl was found buried under a collapsed temple near Hermopolis. It was cracked, wrapped in linen, and tucked beside a single scroll damaged by water, but still legible in parts. What remained was a final entry. No year, no date, just a description. Asterisk cool on the tongue, bitterness like bark, then sweetness, then nothing, and one final line written in trembling hand. She no longer remembers my mouth. Asterisk, was it sorrow? Was it acceptance? No one knows. But what's clear is this: the river had changed. And so had the world. The temples where water tasters once performed their dawn rituals now lie under farmland and cities. The sacred tasting basins are cracked and dry. But in rare places, corners of the museum archives, margins of forgotten scrolls, their influence still ripples. In a healing hymn, you may find a line like, asterisk, bring water that soothes the tongue. In a harvest prayer, let the river taste sweet this year. Asterisk fragments, whispers, because even as the priesthood faded, the memory of what they served lived on, not in facts, in feeling. Today, few would believe that water carries mood. Fewer still would kneel beside a muddy bank and trust their tongue to tell them anything true. And yet, if you've ever sipped from a stream and flinched, if you've ever said, this tastes like metal, or this water feels old, you've remembered them, the ones who spent their lives tasting the breath of the Nile, decoding its shifting voice, honoring its silence. Their gift was not power. It was presence. To stop. To sip. To ask without needing to answer. They never expected. Their names to last. Only the relationship. Only the question. Asterisk, what are you becoming today? Asterisk, and so, here at the river's edge, in a world far removed, you dip your fingers in the water. You raise them to your lips. It tastes of dust and sun, and maybe something else. Something older. You close your eyes, and for just a moment so brief, so faint, you imagine that the river remembers you.